I finished my seat, but it gets better because next week I've got a track day booked for the first drive and shakedown. Let me bring you up to speed. No one, especially me, said this was going to be easy, but I did hope it was going to be a little bit faster than this. But I finally crossed off the last major item off my list, and that means the car is just about ready to drive. As the disclaimer at the start says, this video is not a guide. This channel was always about honest experiences, making mistakes and learning as I go. In making this, some things went well and other things not so much. I'll point out which is which along the way. Let's explain what needs to happen here. Here's a graphic of the car that you see in my intro, and here's a cutaway showing roughly where I sit while I'm driving. Now all of the fabrication work and the selection of the fuel cell went into creating this surface that I could lean against, and the pink line here is a rough representation of that. So what we need to do is pour a seat that contours perfectly to me as well as the car, so myself and it won't slide around. There's two main ways of doing this, and the first is what we call a bead seat kit. In the kit, you get a clear bag and it's filled with small foam beads, and the idea is that you will eventually add a chemical to make this set. But in the lead up, you need to put it in and out of the car, positioning the beads and pulling a vacuum until it's roughly comfortable. The resin is then mixed, goes into the bag, and it has to be thoroughly mixed through before the entire thing goes back in the car. There's roughly half an hour until it sets, so the driver needs to get in, get comfortable before a vacuum is applied to suck everything down. Once it's cured, everything can be trimmed and then covered in tape to protect it. The reason I didn't go for one of these is that they're expensive, and it seemed pretty easy to stuff up if you didn't have experience. From what I could tell, you needed to be quite careful in how you place the beads before putting in the resin and then applying the vacuum. So possibly not a good option to try if I don't have anyone who's done this before to assist me. So I instead went for a more old school method, fire retardant polyurethane expanding foam, this one being two-part. The two components are a 1-to-1 mix by volume. We then pour it into a bag sitting underneath the driver in the cockpit, where it then expands to fill those voids and create the perfect shape. After it's set, it can be peeled from the bag, trimmed and then covered in protective tape. But there will be some sections where there's pretty much no foam because I'm resting against the car. So I've picked up some thin adhesive-backed foam to go against those bits to add structure before the tape is applied. I've also got an additional can-based fire-rated foam to do small additions or fill in voids as necessary. Oh, and to cover the seat, I went for this pretty cheap gaffer tape. I can always redo it in nicer cloth tape later on once everything is finalised. So that was the plan, but how did it actually go? I would definitely need help for this job, so we lined up a day where Matt, Dave and Andy were all free, and Dave even brought his knob with him. You might remember in a previous video, I talked about all of our project cars, including Dave's 20B Cosmo that needed a knob replacement after he gripped it too tightly and broke it. We started the day off with Matt installing the final versions of the panels that covered the fuel cell and fire suppression system. These were being welded up, but were now finished and could be installed. With our encouragement, Dave was trying to insert his knob into every possible situation, whether it be Matt working on the cockpit or putting it in random places for Andy and I, who were starting on a bolt check. Shenanigans aside, it was great to be making progress on all fronts. Matt was almost finished in the cockpit, expanding the opening for the filler neck, smoothing it out and then using some pinch weld to finish it off. This meant that I was finally ready for a test fit of the final seating position. Thanks for the knob, Dave, but I don't think I'll be installing it there. With the bare cockpit ready, we headed inside for lunch for a smoked brisket, and I'm starting to get pretty consistent with these. Add some mac and cheese and we had a feast to fuel the afternoon's work. The thing with this foam is I kind of ordered a lot, 2 20-litre components, and one mix it expands to 20 times its size. These were going to be hard to pour, so to make things easy I bought a pair of these multi-purpose hand pumps. From there I measured, modelled and 3D printed a custom top so the pump could screw into the top of the large container. To get the measurement accurate, I bought myself a pair of big jugs like I always wanted. This setup worked remarkably well. We were able to measure out exact quantities, counting the pumps as we went and using the markings on the jugs as backup. I'm doing it in this dirty bin because this was just a test pour to see how much the foam would expand and try and guess how much we needed. And that stirrer is 3D printed with the link in the description. This small batch went into a black plastic bag, allowing us to time exactly how long the curing took, a dress rehearsal ready for the actual seat. After around 20 minutes, the foam was still a little bit tacky, but it had finished expanding, and we started calculating how much we would need for the seat. Dave and Andy decided to go for a triple bag, taped at the top to keep everything aligned.
Michael, get in. That's it.
I also had to change into my full racing kit because we want to match the actual driving conditions as much as possible. The other job was blanking off all of the voids in the cockpit. This was done with a combination of cardboard and tape, and if you don't do this, the foam can flow around and get locked in place on the chassis. This was one time where many hands definitely made light work. With everything masked off and 2/3 of the harnesses removed, we were finally ready to pour the real seat. That is, of course, after double checking that my helmet had sufficient clearance to pass the follow-up logbook inspection. 50mm clearance was provided and we had a little bit to spare. And just to be thorough, we made sure that Dave's knob could fit in the gap as well. The triple bags were blown open with a fan to make sure there was no wrinkles, and then that was placed inside the cockpit, the rear lip being taped to the car to make sure it wouldn't accidentally fold over. With the final volume decided, we pumped out matching quantities. And then I jumped into the car and the boys tried to massage out any trapped air in the bag. We rehearsed the sequence, put on our safety gear, and because we're in Australia, that includes our mandatory safety thongs. Finally, it was time for action. The 2 components were poured into the mixing bucket, this time a new clean one. That same 3D printed stirrer on a drill was used to mix the 2 components together thoroughly, and the whole time Matt was running a stopwatch on his phone so we could keep track of our cream and set time. I leant forward and lifted myself off the bottom of the car, and then it was all hands on deck to make sure the foam ended up in the right place. Once all of it was in, I lowered myself down and tried to get into my favourite seating position, making sure I could move my legs and I could press all 3 pedals. I could feel the foam heating up underneath me and I could feel it expanding, particularly behind my knees. But the boys had no idea what was happening and kept on peeking down from the top, waiting for it to rise. And then all of a sudden, it was rushing up behind me, and we scrambled to grab some old towels to catch any overflow. Clearly, we had added too much foam, but I couldn't see this, and when I leant back, I almost pushed it all over the back of my head and through the cockpit. But the boys remained calm, told me where to sit, and placed everything needed around me to avoid disaster. When the foam continued to rise, we thought it was best to protect the back of my head and neck in case I ever want to grow a big dirty mullet. Now it was just a waiting game, and it was a pretty hot day with the foam adding a lot of temperature from underneath, but at least I had a large fan blowing across my face that we put in place to aid ventilation. After about 25 minutes, the foam had stopped expanding and was becoming quite firm, so we took the chance to extract myself from the car, but this was very difficult because obviously I don't want to put my foot in the middle of the seat and put a big dent in it, so the boys assisted in untangling me so I could get clear without any mishaps. Only at this point could I see how close the foam was to spilling over into the cockpit, including on the sides where it did, and the boys did a great job with the towels to collect all the foam. So yes, we had too much, especially when you consider this is how much was left in the mixing bucket. With all of that extra expansion, the top of the seat was actually locked in place in the cockpit. Luckily, this problem area was right at the top and easy to access, so we trimmed the foam back, removing segments until it could finally be released from the cockpit. You might notice some of the outer bag ripped, so triple bagging was an excellent idea. Next was the removal of the bags. This was fairly straightforward, apart from some bits that were trapped in wrinkles. Now the trimming could begin, and there was a lot to remove from the top where the foam had overflowed. And can I just say, this small vibrating saw was an excellent tool as it goes through the foam and creates minimal dust. The seat was going in and out many times, and we needed to be fairly brutal here, including that whole top section that sat my head too far forward and would have prevented the necessary clearance of my helmet below the roll hoop. There was also a large unnecessary bulbous section underneath my knees that we trimmed off too. We repeatedly put me in the car, checking clearance and trimming off sections until I could get low enough to match the clearance with no seat. Matt was very skilled at skimming off small amounts of seat, but eventually we did run out of time, so we gathered round to pay our respects to Dave's knob before the guys went home. The basic shape was in place, but as you can see on the right hip, there was a void where the foam didn't flow. Fast forward to the following weekend, and I continued the seat on my own, starting by trimming off a big chunk at the front that wasn't really doing anything and just made it harder to put my feet in position as I got in. I also trimmed the top down further to definitely make sure I could sit low enough. This was laborious work because I had to repeatedly get in and out of the car, testing the fitment and making adjustments. I had the position pretty good, but the seat was pretty flimsy because of the void on the right hip, so it was time to address this using the can of fire-rated expanding foam. I chucked the seat inside a single garbage bag. put the seat in the car, jumped on top of it, and fed the nozzle down into what I thought was the void I was filling. I squeezed the trigger and blew some foam down into the gap. Everything seemed to be going pretty well, but immediately I knew this wasn't going to work like I wanted because the foam felt cold instead of hot, which means it wasn't curing. This is not a two-part mixture, which means it needs air to cure, and there's not much air down next to my hip in that bag. Even by the next day, the foam was still completely floppy and uncured in the bag. But the foam that had dripped out of the nozzle was completely cured as it was exposed to air. I actually had to wait a whole nother week before I could feel it was firm through the bag, and I felt confident enough to remove the bag, and unfortunately the result really wasn't that great. There was a lot of wrinkles and the foam still hadn't flowed down into the area I was trying to fill. So after a bit of cleanup, I changed my strategy, putting the seat into the car so it would have a barrier at least on one side, and then squirting the foam into the void and taping the bag open so it could expand and cure. The next day, everything was cured and there were some pretty interesting growths, except the bits that were touching the bag were a different colour and not really that squishy. There was also quite a bit of work to do to clean up where I sat. So I got to work with the saw and the sander, trimming all of the extra foam back to the correct position, before applying one last round of foam completely out of the bag to fill up any malformed areas. Overnight, this expanded, cured, and once again left me with some work to do. It did take me a couple of hours to get everything nice, but it was made a lot easier thanks to this vibrating saw. It's got a sanding head too, so after you finish cutting, you can then smooth things out. There's colour variation in the final result, but the actual shape is pretty good. The two sides are now close to symmetrical, and all of the indentations required to locate the seat on the car are present on the underside. Finally, I was getting pretty close to this being done, with the next job being removing all of the tape and cardboard from the cockpit and vacuuming out any foam dust. I reinstalled the side harness points and marked where the seat needed trimming to give the required clearance. There was actually room for them to poke through on the sides, but there wasn't really any room for adjusting the buckles, so I went ahead with the cut. There's also a large cut in the middle where the center harness points come through the seat and between my legs. After the cutting, cue more sanding and smoothing to get the shape a bit nicer. I used a vacuum to get rid of dust, peeled back the tape on the adhesive backed foam and slid it down into position. After trimming off the excess foam, I could move on to the final step, trimming it with tape. That bit of exposed foam actually helped the tape stick, and I wrapped it the whole way around because the tape didn't want to stick that well to the foam, but it did stick very well to itself. I've never really trimmed anything in tape before, and I know wrinkles in duct tape are unprofessional, but trust me, I was doing my best. This seat is a pretty awkward shape, but I just kept going until there was no more foam exposed. This all took me a few hours, but finally I ended up with this. A seat that's not only moulded to my body, but the underside is moulded to the chassis, meaning that when I'm on top and the harnesses are holding me down, everything should be nice and snug and not move about. It's possible I'll need to make adjustments after the first track day, so if that happens, I'll probably make the tape a little bit nicer to look at. Despite me eyeballing a bunch of random cutting and sanding, everything amazingly still fits, and the harnesses do line up nicely with the position of my cutaways, and I'm probably going to put a piece of foam on the floor below the belt for a little bit of extra padding. If I ever decide that I want to make a completely new seat, I've kind of got a bit of foam left over. Oh, and there's also these ones too. I've pretty much got enough foam to make hundreds of seats, but I guess that's better than not having enough and running out halfway through the job. In case you were wondering, here's a comparison with an actual Formula 1 seat. These are images from Mark Webber's 2007 Red Bull, and as you can see, the shape is quite irregular and there's plenty of tape used to protect some of the surfaces. The main difference is that there's a thin skin of carbon over some of the shape. So here we are on the cusp of a first drive after almost 2 years. And I have to say a big thank you to David, Andy and Matt for all of their help. And thanks in advance to Andy, who's coming around on the weekend to help me do those last few preparations. So the next video will be the shakedown at the track. And unfortunately it is meant to rain, but hopefully that's just in the afternoon and I at least get some dry running in the morning. By popular demand, we're starting a Patreon. Not for TT Racing, but for Dave's Knob. The Patreon for Dave's Knob is a limited time offer and has already been banned in 17 countries. Get in now and sign up to avoid disappointment.